if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli, and it is now time for the Tuesday night live stream. So, welcome everybody who has joined me. I really appreciate it. And the few topics that I want to get to today, and I hope that the topics will rile you up as much as they've riled me up. So, today, the Kaya Kallas and Ursula von der Leyen announced the 21st round of sanctions against Russia. And I'll come to that in a moment. But first of all, I do want to highlight the contemporary Europe and its adherence to values. As you know, they're always talking about values. That's what differentiates us Europeans, us NATO, us EU from the rest of the world. You know, because we stick to values. We just live by values. We're not like others who think about money, on power, and anything else. We just basically are into values. So in this land of values, you'll recall, I think about a week ago, I spoke about the Russian plan to file a lawsuit against the Baltic states over their practice of persecuting their Russian minorities. This has been going on for years and years. Russians have been complaining about this for years and years, and of course they got very short shrift from the Baltic states and even shorter shrift from the EU. So, but just to show how much the EU and how much the Baltic states are committed to values, you know, what we regard as, you know, the very building blocks of the contemporary liberal West, namely separation of church and state, freedom of religious worship, freedom of association, you know, freedom of speech, and all the other things that supposedly the West adheres to, but of course it doesn't. But anyway, just to show how much the Baltic states are committed to, let's say, the freedom of religion, the Estonia has just announced that it will take measures against the Estonian Orthodox Church unless it cuts itself off from the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, we've already seen a lot of that in Ukraine, the practice of persecuting the churches, you know, attacking them, imprisoning church leaders in Ukraine over the supposed adherence to the Russian Orthodox Church. But now Estonia is moving ahead with it. And so here was the story that appeared in the Estonian media, not in the Western media, but in the Estonian media, which declared that the minister says Orthodox Church must cut ties with Moscow, and then after High Court ruling. And so they say Estonia's interior minister said Monday that the country's Supreme Court decision upholding the amendments to the church's law means the Estonian Christian Orthodox Church must sever its subordinate ties to the Moscow Patriarchate. So the quote, this minister says, the Ministry of the Interior continues to affirm that the purpose of the soon to enter force amendments to the Churches and Congregations Act is to protect freedom of religion in Estonia. This is so they've learned the language of EU and NATO, which is that every time the police come knocking at your door and you're arrested for something or other, it's actually to help freedom. It's to facilitate freedom, to fuel freedom. That's why you're being arrested. So when they crack down on the church in Estonia, then it's in order to protect the freedom of religion in Estonia. So it's always, you know, it's in order to have freedom. So it's just like in the EU, the Digital Services Act, with the goal of which is, of course, to ultimately eliminate X from the European social media space. It's actually, the goal of it is to enhance freedom of free expression. So this means that religious associations operating in Estonia may not have administrative or other subordinate ties to religious institutions located abroad that justify or support war, aggression, or terrorism, and that pose a threat to Estonia's security. So this is how they always say it. Somehow the Russian Orthodox Church um, is supports war, aggression, or terrorism. You could just go around making these claims, which, incidentally, even if true, is neither here nor there, because you're still essentially cracking down on religious freedom. Whether you like the church leaders, you like what their pronouncements, you like their teaching or not, it's still it's a church, and no business cracking down on a church unless you can actually just demonstrate that it is engaging in violence and the rest. And of course, they never do. That's why they present these kind of nebulous assertions like, oh, they support the Russian invasion, they support Russian aggression, oh, they're instruments in Putin's hands. Um, and so just going back there. So here, that's precisely for that reason, we believe that the Estonian Christian Orthodox Church, formerly the Estonian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, must end its subordinate relationship with the Moscow Patriarchate and Patriarch Kirill. So again, governments have no business issuing these orders, such as, well, you have to cut yourself off from the Moscow Patriarchate. The minister also noted that Russia's leadership is trying to portray Estonia as a country that violates human rights and freedom of religion. But Taro stressed, oh, no, 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 no. These claims are not true. This is just Russian propaganda. So of course, it's Russian propaganda. Estonia is a rule of law state. Hey, of course, it's a rule of law state. We impose a rule, and then it becomes a law. The amendments do not result in a ban on orthodoxy in Estonia. The state does not intend to close any church buildings or monasteries until it does. So it's like, they've made clear that's exactly what they're going to do. We don't intend to do it, but we'll only do it if they don't do what we tell them to do. If we were to reach a point where a religious association's activities must be terminated due to prohibited ties, that decision would not be made by the minister or the ministry. Any decision on the forced dissolution of a religious association would be made solely by a court. What on earth does that even mean? A court does it. So if a court closes down a church, that somehow makes it okay. Oh no, that's in accord with values. And then the transition period from the law's entry into force of 6 months, during which the Ministry of the Interior will communicate with all religious associations affected by the amendments, and, if necessary, offer assistance in support of updating their statutes. Anyway, and anyway, so then we have the commenting on the 6-month transition period granted to the Estonian Christian Orthodox Church, during which the ECOC must fully sever ties. This is the Eastern Orthodox Church must fully sever ties with the Moscow Patriarchate. Bishop Daniel, vicar of the Tallinn Diocese of the Estonian Orthodox Church, said that such a serious decision cannot be made so quickly within the church. Many church processes, even if initiated and carried out with the aim of achieving some new status, cannot be resolved quickly. And then, you'd have to say already that they're not exactly putting up a ferocious fight, but I guess they don't, they don't have much much standing. So if you know, so but it's already craven because you can see how they've already conceded a lot of ground to the authorities. Anyway, then we have the president of the Supreme Court, Vilu Kove, emphasized on Monday that although the law has now been adopted and promulgated, it does not end potential legal disputes in situation where the interior minister proposes terminating the activities of a religious association. So notice how they first said, oh, it's not going to happen. There's not going to be any bans. Nothing's going to be closed down. But now the court says, well, terminating the activities of a religious association. We have both freedom of religion and freedom of association guaranteed by the Constitution. No association or organization can be shut down or dissolved except by a court ruling. Okay, well, that's fine. So it's not going to be a government decree. We're going to have it a government decree via a court ruling. And that's what's happened in this case. The government passed the legislation, and the court has said, yeah, this legislation, that's just fantastic. We agree with the thrust of the legislation. So it's done by the courts, not done by the governments, but it's the government that actually promulgated this law. This is set out in Article 48 of the Constitution, and so on. Anyway, and then here is the Supreme Court, the actual ruling. These are the distinguished legal minds. These are some of the finest minds in Europe, the justices on the Supreme Court of Estonia. Estonia, if you recall, was the land run by Kaja Kallas up until recently, until Kaja Kallas's elevation to EU foreign minister status. Anyway, so the Supreme Court rejects the president's challenge to church law amendment. So the president of Estonia had apparently said that this legislation passed by the government may interfere with freedom of religion. But the Supreme Court said, nah, it's okay. So the Supreme Court of Estonia has rejected President Ala Karis's request to declare the amendments to the Churches and Congregations Act unconstitutional. The decision was made by 17 justices, 6 of whom dissented. All right, so that's 11-6. Okay. The full court held that the amendments can be interpreted in a way that does not lead to the arbitrary forced dissolution of religious associations, and therefore do not violate freedom of religion or association. So note the weasel word, arbitrary. So then they say, hey, well, it's not arbitrary. We've got a piece of legislation, and the court has agreed with the legislation. So if there's a forced dissolution, which they first had claimed wasn't going to happen, now they accept it is going to happen. So if there's a forced dissolution, well, it's not going to be arbitrary. But of course it's not going to be arbitrary because you've already adopted legislation. And then it says, last year, President Karis challenged in the Supreme Court the amendments adopted by Parliament that prohibit an Estonian religious association from maintaining ties with a religious organization or spiritual leader located in a foreign country if that entity's activities threaten the Estonian state. So as long as the court says, yeah, it's threatening the Estonian state, the Moscow Patriarchate threatens the Estonian state, then it's fine. You can just dissolve churches that you don't like. According to the explanatory memorandum, the aim of the amendments is to prevent hostile influences. That's always the good word, hostile. It's the hostile influences. Hostile influence activities from reaching congregation members or people living in monasteries. The president argued, however, that the ban set out in the law is too broad and vague and places excessive restrictions on freedom of religion associations. And the court said, no, it's not too broad and vague, and there are no excessive restrictions on freedom of religion. And here it says, this is the president of the Supreme Court declares, the Supreme Court found that the president rightly pointed out problems with the clarity and comprehensibility of the law. However, not every ambiguity or need for interpretation renders a law unconstitutional. In this case, the majority of the court concluded that the law can be interpreted narrowly in such a way that the risks identified by the head of state can be mitigated. So there's nothing to worry about. And then the court noted that, on the one hand, the contested law involves serious interference with the freedom of religious association, as it may lead to the forced dissolution of a religious association. On the other hand, national security and the constitutional order are also at stake, which generally carry weight, greater weight. So that's fantastic. So you can dissolve religious association, you can seize monasteries, you can arrest priests, you know, seize all the riches of any church and land and everything because the interests of the state, the national security interests of the state, carry greater weight. This is the land of values. You know, this is where it's so wonderful and refreshing to be in the EU, where religious freedom is so respected. Anyway, the Supreme Court explained that a connection between an Estonian religious association and a foreign religious organization becomes prohibited only if it poses a threat to Estonia's security. It's hard to see how, and they haven't explained in what sense does the Moscow Patriarchate pose a threat to Estonia's security. But hey, the Supreme Court has ruled, and you know that's good enough for me. This threat must stem from the activities of the foreign religious organization and must be real, not merely abstract. For example, it could involve inciting, supporting, or financing activities against Estonia. Again, notice how all of it is very vague. Activities against Estonia, hostile. Well, since the raison d'etre of Estonia, the raison d'etre of Estonia is living daily hatred of Russia. I mean, the leaders of Estonia spend almost all of their time thinking of ways in which to antagonize Russia, in ways in which to provoke Russia. Then pretty much it's in their DNA to find anything at all in Russia as a threat to Estonia. So it was always just a matter of time before they were going to crack down on, not on the Russian Orthodox Church. It's not. This isn't even against the Russian minority, which is of course a given. They do that all the time. But this is against the Estonian Orthodox Church. They're cracking down on the Estonian Orthodox Church because of its links to the Russian Orthodox Church. And here you can see that there's the report. This was just a couple of months ago. This was a report published by the Estonian Internal Security Service, and they're well known for their expertise on religious matters. So here, this is their annual review. As I say, it came out in April, and you know, it's quite a lengthy section on the Russian Orthodox Church. And so this Estonian internal security body, firmly embedded within the EU values land of intelligence services. It says here, Russia's aggression against Ukraine and its influence operations during Moldova's 2025 parliamentary election demonstrate how religion has become an instrument of the executive branch in Russia. Again, this is just an assertion, no real evidence presented, except, of course, if you're already assuming that everything that Russia does is a hostile act towards Estonia, because, of course, everything that Estonia does is a hostile act directed towards Russia. So it's a nice kind of projecting that's obviously the way the Russians feel about us, because that's the way we feel about them. The activities of the Russian Orthodox Church leave little doubt that the Church cooperated with Russia's security authorities during the preparatory phase of the aggression and continues to do so during the conduct of the war and the annexation of occupied territories. Cloaked in clerical robes, the Kremlin abuses. It's the argument of religious freedom to undermine security and public order in democratic societies. Now, Estonia is not remotely a democratic society. I mean, if it essentially um, disenfranchises, something like 25% of its population, since it persecutes its own religious associations, it's not a democratic society. It doesn't, but because it's being embraced within the EU and NATO, it essentially acquires the sheen of democracy because it's so self evident that the EU and NATO represent democracy. So if you're a member of the EU and NATO, then obviously you're democratic. It's a beautiful circular argument. That what's the evidence that you're democratic? Well, you're a member of the EU and NATO. Nothing that you do demonstrates any adherence to democracy, but that's but it's self-evident. It has to be self-evident that you represent democracy, and Russia represents the other thing. And so here, then it says the Estonian Orthodox Church, which is subordinate to the Moscow Patriarchate and formerly known as the Estonian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, continues to maintain ties with Moscow. Well, that's you have to close them down for that reason. In 2025, the church adopted a new name and introduced cosmetic amendments to its statutes to create the appearance of independence from the patriarch who persistently justifies Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine using Christian rhetoric, which, even if true, is neither here nor there. You're still going after religious associations, and that supposedly is a fundamental right in the land of values. I mean, all this is stated in all the documents, the European Covenant on Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all these fantastic documents that we supposedly adhere to. It's all there. Basically, whether you agree with a religious order, whether you agree with their teaching or not, it's a religious organization, and therefore the state has no business interfering with its own internal affairs. Anyway, the church continues to be led remotely from Russia by Metropolitan Yevgeny, who was forced to leave Estonia after the authorities declined to extend his residence permit on security grounds. Well, that was nice of you. Runs it remotely from Russia because we basically didn't extend his residence permit on security grounds. No explanation. Did he do anything that was in violation of Estonian security? Although the Estonian Orthodox Church presents itself as independent and self-governing, its activities are in fact overseen by the Russian Orthodox Church. As I say, neither here nor there. Guidance and coordination are primarily provided by the name of Patriarch Kirill, and so on, and so on. And then it goes on that in 2025, Estonia declined to extend the residence permit of somebody else, Mikhail Shorokati, a Russian citizen and cleric of the Narva Diocese of the Church, under the jurisdiction of the Moscow Patriarchate, who had engaged in divisive activities. Damn, divisive. So we already had hostile. Now we have divisive. And historical propaganda. Propaganda, so, in other words, again, things that we don't like to hear, in cooperation with the Embassy of the Russian Federation. Shorokati arrived in Estonia from a Moldovan monastery in 2013 and took up duties as a monk priest in the small town of Moshtvy. Since his arrival, he has participated annually in commemorative events in Estonia that support Kremlin propaganda narratives, which could mean almost anything, and that's the whole point. Support Kremlin propaganda narratives. Most recently, in April 2025, he took part in a Russian embassy propaganda event at the grave of Dmitry Ganin, who was killed during the Bronze Night unrest in Tallinn in 2007. Okay, so he was killed, and this was a propaganda event, and which at his graveside. At the event, the embassy accused Estonia of failing to investigate the incident. Well, it obviously, rightly, because the incident wasn't investigated. Russia has made similar accusations since 2007. Yeah, and you haven't investigated since 2007. Anyway, long-term residence permits were also revoked for nuns. God, these nuns, they're the worst. Were also revoked. These violent, aggressive nuns. They don't give them any residence permits. The residence permits were also revoked for nuns employed by the parish of the Estonian Church, Resurrection of the Christ Cathedral in Narva. In 2025, Igumenia Yekaterina Chainikova, the abbess of the Exaltation of the Cross, Jerusalem's Stavro-Begal convent near Moscow, was employed by the Estonian Orthodox Church. No, that's terrible. So she was employed by the ECOC. Okay. The ECOC also maintained an employment relationship with this another nun, the convent's treasurer. It gets darker and darker by the minute. The Exaltation of the Cross, Jerusalem Stavropol Convent, is directly linked to supporting Russia's aggression. Notice these vague, nonsensical claims directly linked to supporting Russia's aggression. Some of its nuns, as I say, the nuns are the worst. Some of its nuns collect assistance for the war effort, including fuel and camouflage nets, visit wounded soldiers, and deliver medicines and food to occupied territories. Oh, this is really terrible. I mean, imagine doing things like that. They're collecting assistance for people who are wounded. They visit these wounded soldiers, deliver medicines and food, maybe even water. The activities go further. In cooperation with the All Russia People's Front, overseen by Sergei Kiriyenko, deputy head of the presidential administration, weapons are also supplied to occupied territories. Is there any evidence that these nuns were involved in supplying weapons? No. The All Russia People's Front was likewise used to interfere in Moldova's election. And as head of the convent, Shanyikova supports Russia's aggression in Ukraine in line with the calls made by Patriarch Kirill. So you'll recall that there was a moment when the EU wanted to sanction Patriarch Kirill, and they went ahead and were quite close to doing so until Viktor Orban said, we can't do this. We can't just sanction religious leaders. And Orban did put his foot down, and the EU backed away. But individual member states can still go ahead and do that. Anyway, so that's the this Estonian Orthodox Church, and then quite by chance, today, where someone to, yes, there was an event at the European Parliament. Quite interesting at the European Parliament, commemorating the horrors perpetrated on the Baltic states by the Soviet Union 85 years ago. Again, this is regular events that take place at the European Parliament, and the European Parliament, of course, exclusively when it deals with World War II, it exclusively focuses on the crimes of the Soviet Union. And so, up until recently, we'd always assumed that the Soviet Union had been the chief architect of the victory of 1945. But no, apparently, the World War II, the crimes committed in World War II were really the exclusive provenance of the Soviet Union. Now, of course, this is without question the way the Baltic states think. It's the way that a number of states in Eastern Europe think. And now they've been brought into the EU, and now this is it's become the dogma within the EU. As I said before, I think when we talked about the Baltic states a couple of weeks ago, the Baltic states are a cancer on Europe. I mean, it's basically the cancer that they are. It's a metastasizing cancer because of the hatred that they espouse. And they basically contribute nothing other than hatred. The hatred that they have for Russia, Russians, and all things Russia has really spread throughout Europe. And that's why these days the European Parliament devotes its time to recalling certain episodes from World War II, not the episodes that uh, that that involved Germany. You think basically the World War II was triggered by Germany. No. It's the episodes that we're supposed to recall involve the Soviet Union. Anyway, so here was this event. It was organized by the European People's Party. That's the sort of right of center. That's the right of center group run by that German Manfred Weber. And so they had that. And of course, Roberta Metsola, who is the Speaker of the European Parliament, and she was there, and then she tweeted this out. Anyway, so here was this the statement that they issued today, which says, 85 years on, Putin repeats Stalin's crimes. So this is already pretty strong stuff, so Putin repeats Stalin's crimes. And so, later they're recalling this 85 years on. So 85 years on, you think, okay, well, that's 1941. That's the year that Nazi Germany unleashed its war on the Soviet Union. It was a war of annihilation, but no, apparently, you don't care about that. In fact, you make Stalin, he's somehow the villain of the thing, even though it was Stalin who basically led the Soviet Union to this great victory, which ensured that Nazism was crushed in Europe and that everyone was freed from Nazi rule. But apparently, Stalin is the chief villain of World War II, and Putin is repeating Stalin's crimes. So, what are we talking about 85 years on? No, we're not talking about Barbarossa. No, we're not talking about the German invasion of the Soviet Union. We are talking about Stalin's crimes in 1941. This is not some fringe group. This is the European, the EPP. This is the main body within the European Parliament. The one that Peter Magyar, his Tisa party, belongs to the EPP. Anyway, here is the statement that was issued. Russia's war against Ukraine is a brutal reminder that history can repeat itself when past crimes go unacknowledged and unpunished. The deliberate killing of civilians, attacks on schools, hospitals, and shelters, and the mass deportation and forced Russification of children echo the crimes committed by the Soviet regime 85 years ago across neighboring nations, crimes that Russia is repeating in Ukraine today. There can be no return to business as usual with Putin. This must be Europe's uncompromising position. This message lies at the heart of today's ceremony in front of the European Parliament building in Brussels, marking the 85th anniversary of the mass deportations and political repressions carried out by the Soviets from the 14th of June, 1941 onwards. So notice 14th of June. So 8 days later, we had the German invasion. They couldn't care less about the German invasion. They couldn't care. Barbarossa, June 22nd, 1941. They go, well, let's talk about the 14th of June. 14th of June, 1941 onwards, organized by the Parliament at the initiative of the EPP group. The ceremony continues a Baltic tradition, reading aloud the names of those who were deported. And then today marks 85 years since the crimes against humanity committed by the Soviet Union against tens of thousands of people from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova. Sadly, such crimes do not belong merely to history. They are being committed here and now against the people of Ukraine, especially children. The name of the Russian state and its leaders may change, but its actions do not. So again, the Russia, the Soviet Union, the one and the same. Today is not only about remembering the victims of the past, it's a call to all of Europe. The value of human life and freedom must never be taken for granted. We must stand up and defend those values to ensure that the crimes of the past are never repeated. All right. Now, this is a familiar cry. Poland has been doing this for years. The Baltics have been doing this for years, which was the Soviet invasion of the Baltic states, the Soviet attack on Finland, and then of course there was the Soviet seizure of territory after the German invasion of Poland. Now, the basics outline of the story is invariably distorted. The Baltic states during the 1930s had pursued a very, very hostile policy towards the Soviet Union. That was okay. That was their right to do so, but it was a very hostile policy. And from 1933 on, the Soviet Union had every reason to expect a German invasion. It came 8 years on, but clearly, I mean, they knew what the original plan was. Now, the, the Soviet Union had to make preparations for this eventuality. I mean, it was going to happen, so they needed to make preparations. The initial plan of the Soviet Union, their initial response to Hitler taking power in Germany was via collective security. So this was the collective security. In other words, that the Soviet Union, Great Britain, France would form some kind of a joint military alliance against Germany, and then they would issue guarantees to a variety of states. Obviously, all of the states that were between Germany and the Soviet Union, and of course on the Baltic states. Now, most of these states absolutely said, we don't want these guarantees. We certainly don't want guarantees from the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union again repeatedly made these offers of the guarantees of security to the Baltic states. They were repeatedly rejected. So when it became clear to Stalin, 1938, particularly after the Munich conference, that the British and the French had absolutely no interest in forming any kind of an alliance with the Soviet Union, and that there was no way that Poland or the Baltic states would accept security guarantees with the Soviet Union. Their argument would be that, well, we can't allow our territory to be occupied by the Red Army, so therefore we're not interested in any security guarantee offered by the Soviet Union. At that moment, the Soviet Union then changed its policy. And therefore, they essentially said, well, we're on our own. It's fairly obvious that we're always going to be on our own. The British and the French are not going to do anything for us. They're actually they'd be quite happy to see a war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, and they let these two monsters, as far as they saw it, let these two monsters fight it out among themselves. And so then the Soviet Union adopted a new policy, which was they had to ensure for themselves as much security against the upcoming invasion as they could. In other words, they had to move their borders as far west as they were able to do, which would give them a little bit of time to prepare in the event of a German attack. Now, the Baltic states and Finland were a particularly sore point for the Soviet Union as it contemplated the upcoming German invasion, because the Baltic states are really, and the Finland are very, very close to Leningrad or St. Petersburg. Um, and so, therefore, once the Baltic states are occupied by Germany, then essentially Leningrad becomes within striking distance, and same with Finland. And so therefore, the decision was made by Stalin to move Soviet Union's borders as far west as possible, and to ensure that in the event of the German attack, first of all, the Soviets would be able to buy some time, but second of all, that the collaborationists and would be minimized, and hence the deportations. Who was deported? Well, the deportations were the people who the Soviets reasonably assumed would be, the kind of people who would collaborate with Nazi Germany. Those were the people who were deported. So whenever you get these kinds of statements, oh, the deportations, all these terrible things that were done, well, they were done in response to an upcoming attack. I mean, so therefore you got to see things in the particular historical context. And of course, the when the attack came, and the Baltic, so initially the Soviet Union took the the Soviet Union occupied the Baltic states, but then in June 1941, the Germans went into the Baltic states, drove out the Soviets, and they were under German occupation. None of that, of course, features in this event at the European Parliament. Apparently, the German occupation is a-okay. They're only talking about the Soviet occupation. But anyway, that's when the Germans occupied the Baltic states, then of course they were able, as they were in Ukraine, to round up all kinds of auxiliary forces who were happy to fight alongside the Germans. The Waffen SS characters, the various internal security people who were happy to work with the SS, and they indeed did commit terrible war crimes. A number of them were, of course, executed, in the Baltic states after 1945. But so none of that is features in this commemorative event. Well, what about the war crimes that were committed by the residents of the Baltic states? Just as if you're going to talk about World War II, then let's talk about World War II. Let's talk about the policies that were pursued by the Baltic states in the lead up to World War II, and their rejection of any kind of a collective security arrangement with the Soviet Union, and then their collaboration, very active collaboration with Nazi Germany in the commission of war crimes. So if that's what you want to do, if you want to talk about World War II, but here this is an absolute disgrace that in the land of values, in this values Europe, they're talking about June 1941. No, they're not talking about Barbarossa. They're not talking about probably the most devastating, destructive, unprovoked attack on anyone in history, or at least in centuries. They're not talking about that. They're just talking about what was done to the Baltic states, the very states that actually actively collaborated with the Nazis. And this is endorsed by, as I say, the European People's Party, the Manfred Webers. It's endorsed by Roberta Metsola. This is how they think about the world. This is how they think about World War II. They're essentially completely embraced the revisionism, whereby essentially the villains of of World War II was not Germany. No, Germany, they're the good guys. The villains were the Russians, and they say it's more or less the same thing. Putin, Stalin, Russia, Soviet Union, it's the same thing. So remember, last week I think we talked about the reburial of Andrei Melnik, the collaborator, the Nazi collaborator, Owen M, the leader of Owen M, and of course, leader of the UPA, who actively fought alongside the Nazis. So we talked about that. This, it was only some of the Poles, some Polish politicians, kind of, were a little troubled by this. They were only troubled by the one aspect of it, which was the because hey, these people killed Poles. I mean, you can go killing everyone else. We don't care about that. I mean, you can kill Russians to your heart's content. We don't give a rat's ass about that. We just don't like the fact that they killed Poles, and only some Poles brought that up. It was the Polish president brought that up, but Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk and the execrable Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski, they didn't think we should bring any of that. That's fine. You want to rebury Melnik? We'll just rebury Melnik. You want to take the knee in front of Melnik? Take the knee in front of Melnik. But here they all are, getting really very very indignant. But 85 years ago, what was done to the Baltic states? And then, so yeah, then, so this is the where are we? So this is today marks 85 crimes against humanity, and then this is says Riho Tiras, MEP, head of the Estonian delegation to the EPP group. And then here's the head of the Lithuanian delegation to the EPP group. I'm glad that the symbolic reading of names is becoming a tradition. The lessons of history are a crucial foundation for European solidarity. The war in Ukraine has shown that past crimes, when not properly acknowledged, can resurface. It is essential not to repeat such mistakes now when war crimes once again becomes a present reality. So this is what I mean by the Baltic states are a cancer on Europe. And as I said, a cancer ultimately, there's only one way to deal with it. You have to cut it out. I mean, the Baltic states, essentially, there cannot be peace and security and stability in Europe as long as the Baltic states are there. So, because these are states governed by one ideology and one ideology only, which is the hatred for Russia. As things stand, they are absolutely at the heart of EU and NATO, and therefore they will continue to advocate for the hate-filled ideology. And here's the Latvian delegation. Russia has deported tens of thousands of Ukrainians, including children, from the occupied territory. This business about the tens of thousands of Ukrainians, and remember, Lavrov said, "Well, can you give us the names?" You said the tens of thousands. Where are these tens of thousands? Give us the names of these tens of thousands of Ukrainian children. They've never done so. They've never been able to list them. Whenever they've come up with a list of some Ukrainian children, it's just, they claim who have been kidnapped. They've come up with a couple of hundred names, and then the Russians say, "Well, okay, if we can locate these children. If they want to go back, they can go back." But here they're talking about the tens of thousands, which is a total fantasy. And then anyway, so this, and then here's Roberta Metsola, one of these the dimwits who run the EU, the Speaker of the European Parliament, and she says their memory endures, and here in the heart of Europe, it is protected and remembered. Today at the European Parliament, we honored and remembered the more than 3 million people torn from their homeland by the Soviet regime 85 years ago. 3 million. I don't know where she got this number from. Moreover, they all returned to their homes. When the war came to an end, they returned to their homes. Though attempts were made to erase their entire way of life, we continue to bring their stories and memory into the light. So this is really the point I'm making, is that these are there can be no reconciliation between Europe and Russia as long as you have this hate-filled ideology that pervades in Europe, and particularly as it emanates from the Baltic states. Anyway, as I said, we had the Ursula von der Leyen and Kaya Kallas declaring today that this is the 21st package of sanctions. I know we just had the 20th. It's already the 21st. So probably next week they're already working on the 22nd package of sanctions. And so here, this is issued by a statement by the President von der Leyen on the 21st sanctions package against Russia. And almost every day now we wake up to the same kind of news. Another major Russian strike on Ukrainian cities, targeting civilians blindly. We also wake up to the news of drones violating European airspace over the Baltics and along the eastern borders. 2 weeks ago, a drone crashed into an apartment building in Romania. Another one exploded in the port of Constanta just last week. Some call it Russian escalation. I see it differently. It is plain and simple failure. 4 years after the start of its full-scale invasion, Russia has clearly failed to subjugate Ukraine. The price Russia pays is heavier by the day and is primarily paid by the people of Russia. They are mourning sons, brothers, and husbands, and at the same time, they face declining living standards and so on. And so that's the basics here. Sanctions have effectively cut Russia off from global capital markets. Russia's economy is slowing sharply. Growth is sluggish at best. Now, it's very touching that you care so much about the condition of the Russian economy, because all of that can be said about the European economy. I mean, Russian economy, it's relatively doing better than the European economy. I mean, there's no growth, whatever. You can say sluggish growth, but Europe doesn't have any growth. And anyway, so then von der Leyen is the continues, and then says that energy revenues fell by around 40% in early 2026, but in fact that's all wrong. The energy revenues are now rising, thanks to the war in the Middle East. Hundreds of vessels from Russia's shadow fleet have been targeted by our sanctions. Export controls are depriving Russia's defense industry of critical technologies and components. So our consistency with the sanction package is paying off. Well, the problem is that it's not paying off in that you're not getting what you want. You're not securing Russia's defeat, and you don't have any chance of securing Russia's defeat. I mean, we can certainly discuss whether Russia is close to winning. That's a separate issue. But in terms of you're not securing Russia's defeat, and you're not going to get Putin to come to the negotiating table and capitulate. That isn't going to happen. And of course, that's not the goal. The goal, with von der Leyen, with Kallas, with these Baltic states and Metsola and everyone else, is let's keep this war going. And then here, she then continues the growth, and so sluggish, and so on. Today, we are putting forward the 21st sanctions package. We focus on the sectors with the highest impact: energy, financial services, crypto trade, including fisheries. For the first time, and we are banning the entry of former Russian combatants into the European Union. Um, and so that's so no visas for them, which doesn't really make a great deal of sense because it's very difficult in general for Russians to get visas to enter the EU. So I don't know that that anyone who has served in the Russian military has any serious expectation that he would get a visa to enter the EU. Um, anyway, that we have here. Energy, the conflict in the Middle East and disruptions to global energy supply chains have eased some pressure on Russia. So therefore, all the crap about how 40 their revenue is down 40%. No, their revenue is up. So the objective of our package could not be clearer. We want to maintain the full intensity of our sanctions, and the way to do this is to ensure that Russia's profits from oil sales remain contained. But how can they be contained when everything depends on world oil prices? World oil prices have risen sharply since February, and Russia gains from the rise in world oil prices. The EU had been planning on somehow maintaining low prices, having this oil price cap. Well, that hasn't worked, and there's a shortage of oil. Our oil price cap has a built in adjustment mechanism to follow the market. It was not made for market shocks like the one caused by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Yeah, but that's really the problem. There's always the unknown. When you make these plans and you think, well, we're going to bring Russia to its knees, you kind of have to think about, well, the best laid plans go wrong. Who'd have thunk that the Middle East is not an ocean of stability? Who'd have thunk that there might be a war in the Middle East? It never happens. It never happens that there's any kind of instability in the Middle East. We just weren't expecting it. So we propose to simply pause the adjustment until January next year. This will give oil markets time to stabilize while preserving pressure on Russia's revenues. So this is just gobbledygook. At the same time, we will continue targeting the shadow fleet. Today, we propose listing 30 more vessels on top of the 632 already sanctioned. For the first time, we're also targeting vessels that assist the shadow fleet, providing bunkering and other services, for example. And we propose targeting critical infrastructure such as ports, airports, refineries trading or processing Russian oil. And then we propose restricting the sale of LNG tankers to Russia, just as we already did for oil tankers. And then second, on financial and crypto and so on, we're expanding our transaction bans to 31 more Russian banks and so on. And then on trade and new export restrictions, and we're targeting more metals and alloys used in the aerospace and defense sectors. For drones, we propose new export bans and so on. And then and then she says gleefully, for the first time, we propose to ban an entry into the EU anyone who has served in the Russian armed forces since the beginning of the war. So Europe stays off limits to anyone who has participated in the invasion of Ukraine. As simple as that. And then sorry, and finally, at the same time, we provide relentless support to our brave neighbor, partner, and future member of the European Union, Ukraine. Yesterday, we delivered almost 3 billion euros from the Ukraine facility. And still this month, we will issue the first disbursement of our 90 billion euro loan to Ukraine. So by the end of the month, we will provide Ukraine with 6 billion euros for drones and more than 3 billion euros worth of macro financial assistance. And more disbursements will follow. All right, so that's pretty much what you would have expected. But you can keep doing this, and the European economy continues to tank, and the Europeans don't have a plan for accomplishing anything. It's just, well, let's just keep it going. And so okay, well, let's just keep this war going. And von der Leyen has absolutely nothing to say about you about Europe, the welfare of Europeans, or anything along those lines. I mean, the only thing that matters to her is, the same thing that matters to the Baltic states is, well, let's just keep this war against Russia going. All right, and there's one other thing that I want to get to, and that is just a continuation of what I was talking about last week in the case of Henry Nowak and his horrific death, um, and really the most shocking aspect of it was the response of the police, and clearly, and we're really only scratching at the surface of what's been going on in Britain really over the past couple of decades, because the police. This wasn't just simply a few bad cops who were there. These are cops who had imbibed the worst, most insidious, politically correct, sociological claptrap, and they were, geared towards assuming that all white people are racist and that minorities have to be protected. The minorities are so saintly people who have to be protected from obviously police racism, but more important, they have to be protected from the real evil of society, which is white racism. So the fact that the police arrived there and Henry Nowak was dying and was visibly distressed and was barely able to utter that I've been stabbed, and the police officer said, "I don't think you have, mate," without doing any proper investigation. The police officers on the scene all accepted the claptrap peddled by the killer, that he had been subjected to a racist attack, and that the man lying prostrate on the ground next to a car, in obvious distress, had committed a crime. He had committed racism, and naturally, the British state is in defensive mode, and they want to essentially try to blame the police officers. Always just a case of bad policing. It's not a case of bad policing. What the police did that night is the result of years and years and years of indoctrination into whatever critical theory, racist critical theory, and all of that nonsense, sociological drivel. And the consequence, these are real life consequences. I mean, some idiot sociologist, some halfwit, pens some article, and then the police adopt this. This becomes their calling card. So, over the weekend, we had J.D. Vance weighing in on what happened to Henry Nowak, and this elicited a familiar kind of pseudo patriotic nonsense from the British political elite. We don't want any Yanks. We don't want Yanks interfering our internal affairs. We don't. We can do our, manage our affairs perfectly happily. We don't need Americans, lecturing us. Except, of course, when the British lecture the Americans, and the British do it all the time. I mean, there's never a moment when the British are more arrogant than when they're lecturing the Americans, because they have this idea that somehow America is an offshoot of Britain, and that therefore every Briton is an expert on America, knows all about America, and is in a position to lecture Americans about their own country and about their practices and so on. So J.D. Vance um, sent out a tweet, rather a good tweet, and here we have this tweet. He said, Henry Nowak died the same way a civilization dies, abandoned, handcuffed by authorities who neither trusted nor cared for him, and accused of hate crimes he did not commit. His murder is as tragic as it is enraging. He should still be alive today, and he would be if the last few generations of European elites had stood their ground against the politics of self hatred and the mass invasion of migrants, many of whom despise the West and the people who love it. And because Henry was far from the first to so needlessly lose his life, and I fear he won't be the last. Each time a life like his is lost, the proper response, the only response, is righteous anger. One of the most important things the Trump administration has proven to the world is that stopping the flow of mass migration and defending national sovereignty is a matter of political will and leadership. Anything else is an excuse. It is because we love the West that we want to preserve it. We love our civilization. We love our country. We love our children. And nobody should ever die the way Henry Nowak died. May God comfort those who loved him, and may God rest his soul. Now, the response, as I said, was this phony patriotism on the part of the British elite. Oh, we don't want people interfering in our internal affairs. And then you have the thing, oh, he's talking about immigration. This doesn't have anything to do with immigration because, the killer, he was British. Think, oh, he's British. Oh, he's a British. He's as British as you and I are. He's British. Yeah, he's a Sikh, but he's British. Now, this is this nonsense that's always been peddled. Like, you have some guy in Dusseldorf who drives his car into a Christmas shopping crowd, and we're told, oh, this is a German guy, this is a German man, he's German, he's as German as you can be, and because, of course, yes, he's a German citizen. He had been given citizenship. That doesn't make him German. So you got a Sikh, just because this Sikh was British, he's certainly a British citizen. He may have been born in Britain. He was born in Britain. But that doesn't make him British. And one of the ways that we can say that it doesn't make him is British is, well, let's take a look at how his family responded to this crime. So remember, he, murders a young man who just basically was engaging in a little bit of harmless banter. He stabs him to death. His brother, another Sikh, his brother, then calls the police to complain that his brother, the killer, had been subjected to a racist attack. That's his response. Somebody's lying, dying there. His response is to call the police and say, oh, my brother has been subjected to a racist attack. So in other words, he's laying the groundwork for a fake defense. Then his father shows up, and the father, another Sikh, what does he do? Well, he doesn't provide, make sure that the dying young man, whom his son has just stabbed, gets some first aid. Maybe just call emergency. Maybe they could just still save his life. He doesn't do that. He just stands around trying to figure out how to help his son, and then the mother, she shows up, and the mother just simply takes the knife and hides it. So that's 4 Sikhs, all as British as as British as you can be. It's like as British as Sir Francis Drake and Winston Churchill and whatever. Um, so that was one argument set against J.D. Vance. Oh no, the British. It's not an issue of immigration, but of course it's an issue of immigration, because the moment you reach a critical mass of migrants, you will have minorities who will claim to be the victims of the authorities, victims of other racial and ethnic groups, and therefore the authorities are going to have to start deciding between the rights and wrongs of uh, the different racial and ethnic and national groups. And therefore, that's when you get into DEI, diversity, equity and inclusiveness. And that's when you have to start deciding about racism and whatnot, because, well, you now have a critical mass of various minorities. So J.D. Vance was absolutely right. Oh, he wasn't an immigrant. Yep, he was an immigrant. I mean, it's sort of why were these people in the country to begin with? Particularly whose Britishness is leaves something to be desired, since their immediate instinct is to cover up a murder. That's their immediate instinct, rather than to try to provide help, which is kind of what you might think. Well, what are British values? Well, to provide help to a young man who was stabbed for no reason, and at least try to see if maybe some first aid can save his life. They didn't think about that. No, so they would just think, well, how do we cover up this crime? Now, the other aspect of it is of course, the way that the British political class has hidden behind the family, the Henry Nowak family, because the Nowak family, they issued a statement, a kind of pro forma statement. Oh, the knife crime is a problem. We don't want anyone politicizing the murder of our son, and all very commendable. But there's a problem with that, and one of which is that the statement that the family issued had obviously been drafted for the family by the government. The government drafted. I mean, it sounds like something that the government would do. So the government trying to hide behind the family, they're basically hiding behind their own statement. And second of all, even if the even if this had been drafted by the family, and the family said, well, we don't want anyone politicizing the death of Henry, it doesn't really matter what the family wants. I mean, they deserve, obviously, respect and condolences and sympathy and everything else, but this is a public policy issue. This is an issue that affects everybody in the country. This is a public matter, and the public will speak out on this matter. You can't stop the public speaking out on a matter that affects the public. So you can't hide behind the family, as if the family has the last say on it. The family doesn't have the last say on it. Least of all, does two-tier care have the last say on it, because it's ultimately the statement that the family issued had been drafted by a flunky of two-tier care. Anyway, we had the the response to J.D. Vance's statement, and it says, BBC here says, Downing Street hits out after Vance post about Henry Nowak. And then it says, after the post on X, the Downing Street spokesman said the Nowak family had said they do not want his death to be used to create further division. Our politics should bring people together, even in the most terrible circumstances. That's who we are as a country. So this is what I mean. The Downing Street spokesman hiding behind, wormy, slimy way, hiding behind the Nowak family, the same Nowak family that you had failed to protect. And then the Crown Prosecution Service has confirmed that Digwa was born British. Oh, he's born British. He's British. He's a British. So the Minister for Children and Families, Josh McAllister, when, I have to say that there had to have been a time when people used to have proper names. Josh. I mean, you're a minister. You're named like Josh. Like some little kid. Josh McAllister also appeared to criticize Vance when he appeared on BBC Radio 4's Any Questions program. There are people who are trying to import that kind of toxic politics here into the UK, and I don't want to have anything to do with it. Oh, I don't want to have anything to do with it. Well, you know, people can can comment on British affairs as much as they like, just as the British comment on everybody else's bloody affairs. They comment on Russia all the time. They comment on America all the time. Oh, I don't want to have anything to do with it. I don't think we need advice from American politicians on how to have effective policing here in the UK. Well, actually, I think you do need advice from whoever, because there is no effective policing in the UK. Anyway, and then earlier in the week, Sakir accused Elon Musk of trying to whip up division over Novak's murder. Posting on X on Tuesday, Musk had written, "Send the video to everyone you know showing how heinously Novak was treated by the police in his dying moments and how the police cravenly kowtowed to his murderer." He had also accused the mainstream media who wrote about George Floyd millions of times of being dead silent about Novak. And then here's the BBC research. Floyd died of cardiac arrest in the U.S. in May the 2020 after a police officer handcuffed him before kneeling on his neck. His murder sparked global protests against racism and police brutality. And now, two things are wrong there. He didn't kneel on his neck; he kneeled on his shoulder. I mean, that was wrong. That was reported wrongly, and basically, he wasn't kneeling on his neck. Also, it wasn't a murder. Murder has a specific meaning, which is, hey, you intended to kill someone. This wasn't murder. You could say the police officer killed him, but even that is questionable, because the initial decision of the medical examiner who did the autopsy was that he died of a drug overdose. I mean, the guy was just, you know, hopped up on drugs. So that was his view. Basically, there was just a career criminal, a lifelong junkie, basically died of a drug overdose. But that, what would you expect from the BBC? And then here we have two-tier care saying, this was a statement of his. This was his tweet from the George, when it was talking about George Floyd. "May I start by expressing shock and anger at the death of George Floyd. This has shone a light on the racism and hatred experienced by many in the US and beyond." So you can comment on the internal affairs of the US, at least if you're an Englishman. You just can't comment on British affairs. "I'm surprised the Prime Minister," that was still Boris Johnson. There have been so many prime ministers, hard to keep track who was prime minister at the time. So that was Johnson was still prime minister. "I'm surprised the Prime Minister has not said anything about this yet, but I hope the next time he speaks to President Trump, he will convey to him the UK's abhorrence about his response to the events." The UK's abhorrence. We are absolutely abhorrent. It's an abhorrent event. And then here we again more on the Sky News. Number 10 hits out at those seeking to capture it. And here we have the Downing Street statement. "The Novak family are grieving after Henry's horrific murder. They have said they do not want his death to be used to create further division, hatred, or tension. We should be respecting their wishes." No. We should not be respecting their wishes. We should be having a proper discussion as to what the hell has been going on in Britain over the last few decades. We're not going to hide behind the family. What the hell's been going on in this country? Our politics should bring people together even in the most terrible circumstances. So this is always the way they do it. Hey, this is a big embarrassment for the British government, obviously, huge embarrassment. So therefore, no politicization, no division. It's now time to come together. But of course, when the British establishment wants to politicize something and wants to sow division, it absolutely does so, as was the case with the George Floyd. Yeah, then suddenly, whoa, let's politicize. Let's be as divisive as we can. Let's take the knee, as Keir Starmer did. And so here, there's, and then Sky News U.S. correspondent David Blevins said it's not unusual for the Trump administration to point to tragic murders in a bid to justify its policies on mass immigration and national sovereignty, but it's an entirely different matter altogether for one party in what we often call the special relationship of the U.S. to accuse the other, the U.K., of having a two-tier criminal justice system and overseeing civilizational decline. Well, Britain does have a two-tier criminal justice system, and it's overseeing civilizational decline. And why is this correspondent editorializing? And then we have, responding to the U.S. State Department comments, Deputy Prime Minister David Lammy, who is, of course, as thick as two planks, one of the dumbest people ever to go into political life. He says, I don't recognize the caricature of Britain having a two-tier criminal justice system. I just don't recognize that. And anyway, then there's just more on this. And then, but Lammy, having first said he doesn't recognize this as two-tier policing, Lammy says, well, police can't always treat races equally. Oh, so we can have two tiers. So having first said there's no two-tier policing, Lammy says, yeah, there is two-tier policing, and a bloody good thing too. So the Telegraph. Lammy, police can't always treat races equally. And then we have the Justice Secretary gives examples of officers allowing Jews leeway on Sabbath as he addresses race row. And so police may not always need to treat people of different racial origins equally. The Justice Secretary suggested there could be a cultural circumstances in which police officers might treat someone from an ethnic minority differently. Mr. Lammy cited as an example police deciding not to ask a Jewish person to turn up at a police station during the Sabbath, which begins each week at sunset on a Friday and continues until nightfall on Saturday. Well, that's very interesting. I had no idea that you could, if you're Jewish, you could simply say, hey, it's the Sabbath, so I'm just not going to show up. I know we're investigating a murder, and that I'm a witness to possibly this crime, but I'm simply not going to show up because it's the Sabbath. And the police say, well, that's all right, sir. I understand about the Sabbath, so take your time, and when the Sabbath is over, then whenever you have a moment and when you've had your breakfast, then please show up, and, let us know when you'll have time to show up. So apparently, interesting his example as to who's entitled to make claims of on special dispensation, who exactly doesn't have to show up when he's ordered to do so. So I think the rest of us, I think, is in a different case. Police tell you show up, you don't have any choice. You know, as I found out at Heathrow, you don't have the choice of saying I don't really feel like answering questions because I'm a little busy and I've got some religious whatever dispensation. So just like Digwa, the Sikh, well, he's allowed to carry a knife. So hey, well that's according to his religion. And apparently on the Sabbath, I just can't do it. Anyway, here this is Lammy, Um, and then he goes on. He told the BBC, "Look, there are particular circumstances in which, of course, the police have to go a bit deeper than treating everybody equally." So yeah, having said no two-tier policing, apparently we do have two-tier policing, and bloody good thing too. So Lammy made the comments amid a row over police race guidance that advises officers to treat ethnic minority suspects differently. Oh, so there is two-tier policing. He made the comments amid a row over police race guidance, or the police race guidance. Well, that's interesting. So you first deny that there's two-tier policing, and now you tell us about this police race guidance that advises officers to treat ethnic minority suspects differently. MPs have blamed the guidance published by the National Police Chiefs Council last year for the actions of officers who arrested Henry Nowak for alleged racial abuse while he was dying of stab wounds. He said he was a tenet of British justice that everyone should be treated equally under the law, but he added that there may be circumstances where the police do have to consider certain factors. Oh, that's yeah. And then he talks again about this. Let me give you an example of the police, the Orthodox Jewish community and the Sabbath and so on, so on. And there are particularities in relation to the behavior of our community as a result of that. Expecting someone to turn up and present themselves at the police station in those circumstances in a religious festival might be unacceptable. It's unacceptable. Of course, it's a religious festival. He's got the Sabbath. It's unacceptable. And then, somebody else is basically, well, hey, it's Ramadan. I can't do it. Sorry, I can't do it. This is the time for Ramadan. So I won't be showing up at the police station. Oh, well, sorry, sir. Or Yom Kippur. I'm sorry. This isn't the time to be to be answering police questions. Just like Digwa, I have to carry a knife. It's in accordance with my religious practice. And so yeah, that it continues, and then Lammy, goes on and says, "Well, I rang J.D. Vance and told him he was wrong about Novak murder." So then again, well, what was he wrong about? Well, what exactly is he wrong about? And Lammy said he phoned up Vance, and he was wrong to blame Henry Nowak's death on the mass invasion of immigrants. And then he said, Mr. Vance accused European elites of failing to stand up for the politics of self-hatred and mass immigration who despise the West. And then Lammy said, this has got nothing to do with mass migration. This young man was a Brit. But he was a Brit. He's British. He's a Brit. I mean, just you can't be more British than that. I mean, he looks British. He carries a knife like an Englishman. He's a Sikh, which is one of the religions that the British have traditionally adhered to, and so he was a Brit. Now, all of this is, of course, based on this nonsense that you just you become a British citizen and therefore you are a Brit, which is everyone knows that it's complete nonsense. But you can just simply say, oh well, he's is a Brit, because he has a citizenship. So again, if you arrive in the UK, spend 5 years there, and you make your application for a British citizenship, then lo and behold, you're a Brit. Said, well, you just stab someone to death for no reason. Your family, immediately goes into a cover-up mode without demonstrating the slightest pity for the victim. They behave like a tribe, like a clan, like the most primitive person imaginable, without any empathy for the human who's dying. But he's a Brit. He's a Brit. And anyway, so then he goes, and then Lammy told, I also urge him, it's not helpful to tweet in this way. We can tweet. And Lammy was another one who was pontificating at great length during the George Floyd riots. I also urge him, it's not helpful to tweet in this way, partly because of what the Nowak family have asked for, and reminded him about their desire not to make this issue of division. So they all just repeat this. It's like they've been given the talking points. Oh, it's the family. They don't want a division, and therefore we have to respect the wishes of the family. Um, Asked on BBC whether the police should take into account the color of someone's skin, he said, "We are all equal before the law, so that's not the starting point, but it is still the case that on arrest, on prosecution, conviction, I'm afraid, in our prisons, ethnic minorities are disproportionately in the criminal justice system." Oh, okay. And so therefore, the implication, the moment somebody says that, the implication is they are there because of racism. So context can matter, but it cannot eclipse violence or the fact that we need our police to act to mitigate and deal with crimes in our communities, whatever your color of your skin or background. So it's gibberish, but he does say there, well, we have minorities in prison, therefore they're there because of racism. And then here is this guidance, the guidance that demonstrates the two-tier policing. This is from this National Police Chief Council. Police Anti-Racism Commitment. So here it is. It's very pretty. And here it is, this anti-racist commitment. The Police Service of England and Wales is committed to anti-racism and racial equity. Racism is a very real issue in policing. We acknowledge the problems we have had with racisms in the past and still have today. We are sorry. We the police, are sorry for the damage racism has caused and continues to cause. Racism, regardless of whether it is individual, institutional, or systemic, is completely and utterly unacceptable and has no place in our profession. It is not enough for us not to be racist or to claim not to be racist. Anti-racism. This is the police. This is the police who are saying all this. This isn't, some activist. This is the police. Anti-racism demands that we are proactive, which is consistent with our legal duties and code of ethics. It also requires us to remain vigilant because racism is insidious and will always be a threat to our model of policing by consent. And then it says, so our commitment to anti-racism means taking a stand against racism in all its forms, proactively, this is always a good one, proactively identifying, understanding, and tackling racial inequalities in policing, performing policies and practices that lead to people from different ethnic groups being over-policed, underprotected, or marginalized. So in other words, this is, they're the victims. Not white people. White people aren't the victims. The ones who are actually the victims of crimes. They're not the victims. It's the minorities that are the victims. Reforming policies and practices that lead to people from different ethnic groups being over-policed, underprotected, or marginalized. Working with partners to tackle the racial inequalities that exist in wider society and which are reproduced and sometimes exacerbated by policing. And then producing equality of policing outcomes for people from different ethnic groups. See, this is by responding to individuals and communities according to their specific needs. There it is. And there's your admission that there's two-tier policing. Producing equality of policing outcomes for people from different ethnic groups by responding to individuals and communities according to their specific needs, circumstances, and experience, with understanding that these will be racialized and with the aim of reducing harm. It does not mean treating everyone the same or being colorblind. It does not mean treating everyone the same or being colorblind. And there's our commitment, zero tolerance of racism in policing. Police will adopt an explain or reform approach to address the negative impact and outcomes experienced by black people. So they have to explain and reform. Policing will ensure that officers and staff understand the history of policing black people and the ongoing impact and trauma of disproportionality. So there, these black people have to live with the trauma of disproportionality, and the police have to understand that trauma. Development of a representative workforce. Policing will increase the involvement of black communities in its work and improve support to black victims of crime. And then black people and communities are properly represented within policing. And then introducing a mandatory training program for all officers and staff on racism, anti-racism, black history, and its connection to policing. And there it is. There you are. There it explains perfectly why the police behaved the way they did that night. Mandatory training program for all officers and staff on racism, anti-racism, black history, and connection to policing. Improving the recruitment, retention, and progression of black people through mentoring and talent and so on. Understanding and addressing racial disparities through consistent recording and reporting of pay gaps and so on. And then addressing racial disparities and misconduct and disciplinary processes through end-to-end review. And then it still have, and then black people and communities are respected and treated in a fair and equitable way, developing a new national approach for forces to identify and tackle racial disparities in the use of police powers, promoting consistent recording, analysis, monitoring, and publication of data, and so on. And then, where's this? It says strengthening national and local approaches to engaging with black communities and reviewing, and then assessing the impact of neighborhood policing on community confidence, and then developing a framework for reconciliation between policing and black communities based on research and emerging practicing forces. And then they show black people are protected and properly supported as victims of crime and as vulnerable groups. And there it is. Improving our understanding of disproportionate black victimization and enhancing the service victims receive, developing a more effective police response to hate crime committed against black people. There it is. Developing a more effective police response to hate crime committed against black people, improving policing's response to vulnerable groups within black communities, including those at risk of criminal exploitation and people with mental ill health. So, as I say, this is the police that write this, and they're openly saying, we're not going in for any policing that treats everybody equally. No. We have a special case. We have a special case. We're in the business of protecting minorities, colored minorities, and therefore we will accept as true anything that suggests that a member of a minority has been the victim of racism. So as I say, what's happened in the case of Henry Nowak, and the whole thing may well be just swept under the rug. I mean, that's what often happens in Britain. It may well just be swept under the rug, and what had led to it, the years and years and years of indoctrination in this ridiculous sociological claptrap about racism and anti-racism and black victimization, and how that actually led to the murder of a young man. It could well be swept under the rug, and it will be unless people bring that up and don't allow themselves to be intimidated by this thing. But we've got to respect the wishes of the family. No, we can't talk about this because that's divisive. The wishes of the family. Anyway, let's now go to our locals page and see what the members of the Gaggle locals community are thinking. As I say always during our live streams, if you want to um, interact with me, you want me to address your comments, you want me to answer your questions, please join our locals community. So it's a fantastic community, really, really talented and smart people are members of it. And locals board is continually every minute is getting updated with really fascinating information, and so it's well worth your while joining us. The gaggle.locals.com, and so you'll be able to, not just to interact with me, but to interact with other gagglers. So the gaggle.locals.com. So anyway, here's Danaki, one of our most prolific posters, has been really from the beginning of the Gaggle. And Danaki says, since the subject of not war has become totally and unbearably boring, could you list and talk a bit about your favorite books and authors, novels, poetry, and plays? Well, it's it's always hard to say. Well, what is your favorite authors? I am a big fan in terms of as a literary accomplishment of the great novelist Dostoevsky. I don't know which of his novels are my favorite, but I think The Possessed, Crime and Punishment are just amazing piece of work. It's just extraordinary that somebody was able to eh, produce so much in a relatively brief amount of time. So I really admire that. In terms of what I enjoy reading, because Dostoevsky, to be honest, is that's some serious reading, a serious commitment that you have to make to read it. But in terms of what I enjoy reading, I have to admit that I am very partial to the English writers, the masters of the English prose. Obviously, one of my favorite writers, ones who I always, whenever I get when I get depressed, whatever, what do I turn to read? As P.G. Wodehouse. It's always delightful. At whatever period in his life, he wrote a huge amount. He lived for many, many years. But it's always a delight to enter his kind of almost magical world. And he's a fantastic writer. He's a great stylist, and he's very, very funny. Um, but I also like the even the classical writers, in as stylists. Dickens, Jane Austen, um, wonderful masters of the English language, and then of course uh, the the more other kind of great writers of the 20th century, something like Evelyn Waugh, at least his early comic novels that I enjoy. Um, in terms of plays, what do I like? Well, I have to say, in recent years, um, I have become a great fan of the plays of Harold Pinter. I didn't used to like him very much. When I was younger, I didn't think there was much to them, but I do now find them very entertaining. Again, he's a kind of the master. Again a master of the pithy comment and the sort of the menace that is inherent in so many social interactions. So it's always just when you watch a Pinter play, you kind of learn things from it. You say, "Hey, I never really saw this before." So I do enjoy his plays. Um, Poetry. I have to admit, I don't not a great not a great reader of poetry. I guess my taste would be fairly um, predictable. I like the poetry of T.S. Eliot. I mean, it's again, that's a fairly safe and predictable choice. But you have to say, yeah, he is a great poet, and so I do enjoy reading him. Um, so that, but so you haven't talked about music, and when it comes to music, I'm a big fan of Wagner's music dramas, and I'm happy to say that I will this month of June, I will see 3 out of 4 uh, uh, music dramas of the Ring cycle. 3 out of 4. So I'm really looking forward to that. That's going to be towards the end of the month. So anyway, thank you so much, Danaki. And then Stone River says, thank you so much, Stone River. It's very generous of you. Says, George, you always seem to be in a good humor. Am I? I don't know. No one's really accused me of that. Don't you ever get depressed about the state of the geopolitical world? Yes, I think so. I mean, I wouldn't say I am in good humor during these live streams. I wouldn't have said that, you know, at other times I'm always in a good humor. And, I actually often in a very bad humor. Um, but in terms of depressed about the state of the world, it's not so much I get depressed. I get depressed. I mean, state of the world. You say, okay, well, things are pretty dark and pretty bleak, and but maybe they always have been. Maybe it's less dark and bleak. Now than maybe a few generations ago. I mean, say my parents' generation. But what I think does get me down is the dishonesty. It's when people are lying, when people are transparently taking you for a fool and they're trying to pull the wool over your eyes. That kind of gets me angry. So I spend quite a lot of time here at the Gaggle analyzing what Ursula von der Leyen or Kaya Kallas or Merz or Macron do, because that does get me angry. Um, because they're lying to their publics, they're leading their publics to disaster, and ultimately, obviously, it's depressing that people put up with it. That however obvious the lies are, the people just like sheep, they continue to follow it. I mean, if one thinks about the and I was going to mention this today, because I was thought of the bombing of Yugoslavia, which is now 27 years ago, because today, out of the woodwork came George Robertson, and I'd forgotten about Robertson. And George Robertson, who had been UK Defense Secretary during the bombing of Yugoslavia, and then because of services rendered, he became the Secretary General of NATO. He took over from Javier Solana, and that kind of and that he issued some statement today about how the British government needs to cut all kinds of government services because it needs to spend a hell of a lot more on its military. That's all that matters to him. And I kind of remember, how disgusting and how it made me so angry that these sanctimonious, self-righteous pricks like George Robertson, the chubby George Robertson, would denounce the Serbs and would present themselves as heroic figures. They were heroic in pulverizing a tiny country that hadn't done anything to anyone, and yet they presented themselves. We are heroes. We're taking on the bully. We're going after these horrible bullies, the Serbs. You're the bloody greatest military force in the world. You can wipe Serbia off the map, a million times over, and yet they present themselves as heroic figures. Now, when somebody does that, that does get me upset. So that's why today I was just remembering how obnoxious George Robertson was. I'd forgotten all about him until he suddenly popped up, with this statement, and that's the thing that upsets me. If one thinks about wars and sanctions and everything. Yeah, I mean that's always with us. But lying, hypocrisy, deceit, self righteousness, bullying, that's pretty creepy, and that really annoys me. That does get upset me. Um, so it's nice of you to say that I'm in good humor. I try to be here at the Gaggle, but a lot of times I am quite upset. And but and this feeling is often directed at really really disgusting individuals who have elevated themselves into these powerful positions. So, for instance, today when I was reading out that statement from the Baltic states, that kind of got me angry. I mean, the idea that now, 85 years later, you can forget and just ignore what was done by the Nazis to the Russian people. You can ignore that and instead focus on the Baltics as if they were the real victims, the very people who then collaborated with the Nazi invaders. That the idea that you can get away with that now, that sort of thing does put me into a bad humor. Anyway, thank you so much, Stone River. And then Robert, thank you, good to see you again, Robert. And Robert says, so true, the geopolitical world seems to produce nothing but misery. Yeah, I think so. The market society, in stunning contrast, gives us endless wonders. I must confess to being eternally amazed that anarcho capitalists are so few in number. Um, well, I guess they're few in number because ultimately, I don't think. Um, I don't think that argument has been persuasive. I mean, the argument that if you leave everything to the markets, um, then all problems will be righted. I don't think that whether it's true. You can't you don't persuade people because people always say yes, but you will never have the perfect market. And if you never have a perfect market, then the state will have to intervene. And when the state intervenes in one thing, it will have to intervene in something else. And so, therefore, you will never have the that perfect market mechanism, the ones that Milton Friedman talked about so eloquently. And because of that, I just don't think that argument has ever been won. I mean, there've been a lot of attempts by advocates on the market to make the case, but it's never been persuasive. And I go by the arguments made by Schumpeter in his famous book Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, when he himself was actually persuaded by the virtue of the market. He actually believed in markets, but he said there's just no way that we advocates for markets, advocates for capitalism, there's no way we can ever win this argument. And we just have to accept that we're going to lose the argument, and we're going to lose the argument to statism. People will always want some, ways to rectify wrongs, and then once you bring in the state in one direction, you're going to have to bring it in another direction to rectify that, and then you have to rectify that. So ultimately, it's never going to happen. And that's really has been true for centuries. I mean, for centuries, there's been a fairly consistent pattern of state intervention in economies. You're going back to the pre-capitalist era, mercantilist era, the medieval era. It's a fairly consistent. If you think of how much of the economy is taken over by the state, it's remained pretty consistent over the centuries. And then you have to think, well, there's a reason for that. Why is the state, always, you know, taking a sizable chunk of the economy? And I'm just talking about in the West. I mean, leave aside issues when communism was introduced in Russia or in China, but just in the West, going from the Middle Ages, the mercantilist era, and everywhere, the government's take of the economy has remained pretty consistent. Anyway, thank you so much. Very, very interesting as always, Robert's observations. And then Summer Petrus, glad you could join us. Glad that you're able to. Um, I can see your comment. I wasn't able to last week. So George, last week you went through line by line, the court proceedings of the trial of the murder of Henry Nowak, which happened last year in an English city. The record was truly heart-rending, and I have to admit I was forced to skip some of the detail. Well, understandable. Unlike you, however, the Church of England was silent on this crime, issuing no public statement. What is your opinion on the current state of the Church of England, and what should its correct role be within the British state and society? Yes, it's an amazing thing that the British Church of England is just this completely meaningless, vacuous entity that is unable ever to, to speak on behalf. This is supposed to be the official religion of the country. This is the official religion. This is the state religion, and yet it's unable ever to articulate the feelings and longings of its parishioners. And so, if you would listen to the spokesman for the Church of England, they spout all of this nonsense, the nonsense that was spouted by that judge, the nonsense that was spouted today, when we went through that anti-racism commitment by the British police. This is what they do. They all embrace, multiculturalism. They all embrace, multiracial, multicultural society, and so on. They don't do anything. They don't in any way espouse the values of their parishioners. And what is so particularly disgusting about that, and I know I've talked about this before, that there they were when when the King Charles was was crowned, during that coronation ceremony. They went back to all the great traditions, and then they went through the whole the anointing him, and this holy oil, and this, suddenly they tradition, all of that tradition of the British Church. You're going back more than 1,000 years. So suddenly, when it comes to their own well-being, their own their own money and power and prestige, when they have to keep in with the king, they do know something about tradition. They do know something about the continuity of the church and the British people, the continuity over centuries. Well, the continuity. This crown and this church. Yeah, that goes back. More than 1,000 years. Oh, well, that's interesting, because you've been telling us that that this Digwa and all the rest, they're as British as anybody. This is the Britain. This is today's Britain. Some some guy carrying around a knife. That's today's Britain. And the policing. Oh, that's today's Britain. Well, that's where you are, because I think most British people would like to feel that they belong to a Britain that goes back centuries. They want to feel that they want to be a part of that tradition. They want to feel that, yeah, this country. This is the same country. This is the country of the great cathedrals. This is the country of the monasteries. This is the country of Westminster Abbey. This is the country of of the crown. And so they say, yeah, that's what people, that gives them that sense of belonging, and that so they obviously, people have difficulties articulating that, but that's what they mean, what people want to belong to, which is very difficult to articulate, but nonetheless, I think that's what people want. Yeah, this is the England, this is the England, the Great Britain that I and my parents, my grandparents, my great grandparents, they belong to that. This is the same, long, the great chain of being, great chain of generations, and I'm a part of that. And they expect the Church of England to give voice to that, to express that, since it is the official state religion. So give us a sense of that. But so you do it for the king, you do this obsequious thing for the king, and he puts on this fancy crown, but you're not willing to do it for the members of the church. And that I think makes it disgusting. And as you said, they didn't say anything about this horrific event, and that's entirely typical because they adhere to yeah, tradition for us, multiculturalism for you. Yeah, we get to anoint with holy oil, a ceremony going back 1,000 years. Yeah, they, hey, this is what where King Edward the First sat. Oh, we can do that. That's for us. But you people, you get multiculturalism. So that's what I think of the what I think of the Church of England. The Summer Petra says, I hope to visit Hungary next in the autumn. Hopefully, it will still exist. Well, I hope so too, because right now, and I was hoping to talk about that. Maybe I'll talk about that next time. Things aren't looking good. I think things are looking like there's going to be a real ugly, ugly, nasty reckoning taking place in Hungary. The people who've now taken power, they mean business, and they mean to go after their predecessors, which is Fidesz. So things, I think, are going to get quite ugly in Hungary very, very soon. I think it's already happening, but it's going to get even uglier. Anyway, thank you so much, Summer Petrus. And Cynthia, always very good to see you, Cynthia. Cynthia, as I always say, a film scholar, a resident film critic, with an amazing encyclopedic knowledge of cinema history and encyclopedic knowledge of film production, who every week graces us with the fruits of her knowledge and her research. And we always learned. We're always very fortunate to learn so much from her. Every week we have a Monday night at the movies screening, and every week we get to enjoy Cynthia's observations and background briefings on this film. So this week we have a Polish classic from the 1950s, Night Train, very well worth watching rather. It's a kind of a dark movie, very, very atmospheric. This was the strong element in that cinema of Eastern Europe, particularly Polish cinema, which is they were very strong on atmosphere, which kind of keeps you on tenterhooks as you wait for the denouement. So really enjoyable. It's relatively short, as a lot of these East European films. Very short, but the film packs a punch. So if you want to see something different, films that are kind of low budget, simple sets, a simple story, but with much deeper layers of meaning, and then watch this film. I think it's well worth anyone's experience. So Night Train, I think it's made in 1959. Watch the film and enjoy Cynthia's briefing and very interesting aesthetic judgments. Anyway, here Cynthia says, Iran is pulling off a brilliant move in the Strait of Hormuz, dodging tolls by calling them green fees. The clever setup mimics the deal with China, where ships pay for upkeep rather than transit, by framing it as eco protection, Iran perfectly weaponizes the carbon tax rhetoric of Western elites, um, the Western elites that love to lecture about. You'd think green obsessed European leaders would cheer. Instead, the West is furious. They love climate penalties until a rival outsmarts them using their own playbook. Oh, that's an excellent point, and that's very amusing. Yeah, you're right. I mean, Iran has been very clever in saying, no, we're not taking a toll. We're not charging a toll, because if they'd done that, then it would be the legality of it would obviously be dubious. But if you say that this is an administrative fee or it's an environmental fee, then I think you can absolutely do that. You say, well, yeah, no, this is absolutely right. We have to maintain the strait. It's very, very narrow. An awful lot of shipping goes through the strait, and we have to make sure that the environment is kept up. That the possibility of accidents, oil spills, and everything else is minimized. And so I absolutely agree. I think they've been very clever in doing so, and I don't really see how Iran can be stopped from charging this fee in future, because Turkey also charges a fee through the Straits of the Dardanelles. Also, they don't call it a toll, but they do say it's an administrative fee. So you can absolutely do that. You are within your rights to say, well, we need to ensure that the strait will be used by ships for decades and centuries to come, and therefore we need to invest in environmental protection. So it's a very reasonable argument, and you're absolutely right, Cynthia, that the European leaders are kind of hoist by their own petard. Hey, here's Iran that is talking about how do we make the environment cleaner and safer for everyone. So yeah, that's exactly right. But of course, in the case of the West, whenever they talk about environmental protection, it's always in order to punish their own people. So in other words, it's telling them, hey, stop using your car. Don't use your car to go on your holiday, or go for a drive into the country. Hey, stop eating beef, because these cows, they destroy the environment. So cut back on your beef consumption. Hey, just cut back on your meat consumption altogether. You're eating too much meat. How about consuming bugs instead? So when the Europeans start talking about environmental stuff, it's always with a view to punishing ordinary people. It's always with a view to making their life more miserable and more intolerable. And rather than what I think Iran is doing, which is, hey, let's just enjoy a cleaner, safer environment. But the environmental agenda in the West has always been driven by a fundamental antipathy to people. Almost from the beginning, ever since the environmental movement took off in the early 1970s, it was always driven by, hey, you need to stop enjoying your life. You need to stop consuming. Cut back on your electricity consumption. Cut back on your gas consumption. Cut back on your meat consumption. Cut back on going on holidays. Always driven by, hey, we hate the fact that ordinary people now enjoy a you know a better, more prosperous style of life. No, we got to get you back into the into the misery of a previous century. So it's always had an anti-human quality, and it's still there after 50 years on. It's still driven by a kind of anti-human quality, and I think Iran's agenda is different. So I agree with you, Cynthia. So thank you for that. Um, and then Robert says Your analysis of the EU rehab of German World War II history calls to mind the father, the final scene of Doctor Strangelove, when the wheelchair-bound scientist suddenly rises and claims, "Mein Führer, I can walk." The joke is that an impulse thought buried has merely been dormant. Yeah, that's right. Some of the EU's elite's enthusiasm for writing history, centralizing authority, and cultivating hostility towards Russia can appear oddly strange-lovian, as though an old spirit has suddenly found its feet again. I think that's brilliantly put. I agree with that. That's exactly it. Somehow it had lain dormant, and everyone had been hiding it. And this is obviously the case with the Germans, who had persuaded us all for decades, ever since 1945, that all these terrible things in the past, they put it behind them. This is a new Germany. They're committed to democracy, human rights, freedom, justice. They're not going to. This is the new Germany, very very different from the old Germany. And then we find it's very much like the old Germany. They don't even bother pretending as they spew their hatred for Russia. You think, wait, this is going back a century, and determination to continue with this war against the barbarians from the East. They don't even hide it, barbarians from the East. And then when you have here are the Baltic states that talk 1941, June 1941. What are they talking about? Not Barbarossa, not one of the shocking. It's still quite a shocking event, that essentially the unleashing of a war of annihilation against the Soviet Union. They're not talking about that. They're talking about what the Soviet Union did to the Baltic states. That's the event of June 1941. You've completely wiped away history, and so the only thing that we can talk about when it comes to World War II is what the Soviet Union did, the crimes committed by the Soviet Union. We've now completely eliminated from our consciousness, from anything the European Parliament does, European Commission does, we've eliminated from that anything that Germany did. Germany are the good guys. The Germans are the good guys. It's everything is what the Russians did. And you can't get more extreme in your revisionist history than that. That the winners, the liberators of Europe, the people who actually broke the back of Nazi Germany, they broke its back. It would not have been defeated had it not been for the Soviet Union. They broke its back. The very people you should be grateful for, they're not perfect. Of course, they're not perfect. But the people you should be grateful for liberating the world from Nazism, they turn out to be the great villains of World War II. And there it is. That's in the European Parliament, and it's by this European People's Party, this grouping in the Parliament, this Manfred Weber. It's just amazing. Anyways, so I absolutely agree with you, Robert. And then here we have, and then Cynthia says, with Father's Day around the corner, here are films capturing the wide spectrum of fatherhood. Oh, that's interesting. From protective surrogates to flawed patriarchs. The cinematic lineup spans from the bonds of The Bicycle Thief. Okay, we haven't had that. That's interesting. That's Angels in the Outfield, Weekend with Father. Okay, that's good. To Unconventional Mentors in Shane. Okay, it's interesting. HUD. And A Thousand Clowns. A Thousand Clowns, yeah. I mean, it's with Jason Robart. It's not one. I mean, it's an interesting film. I mean, I'd be for screening it. I never liked it very much, but it's an interesting film. It's worth screening. Thousand Clowns, and finally, it explores the complicated family legacies of The Godfather, yeah, Paper Moon, and The Great Santini. Okay, these are good titles. I mean, that's interesting. Paper Moon, yeah, I've forgotten about that. It's a while ago, but it's one of these. It was almost forgotten now. It was a big deal at the time, but it's forgotten. But there are really interesting films there. Yeah. Okay, I think it's an excellent idea. Thank you so much, Cynthia. Really, really, that's a good theme, and I think there's a good titles to go with that theme. Thank you. And then MKMRD says, Election times are peak times for terrorism here nowadays for some reason. Yeah, I think so. Um, but yeah, but I think that the terrorism is now becoming ingrained. It's not just limited to election times. But I agree in general. 2024 was not a good year for that. Thank you so much. Aristotle 1, thank you so much for your generosity. Depressing that we are so corrupt that we sanctimoniously persecute nuns helping the wounded in war zones. No, that's exactly right. That's very true. And they report this in this the security report, and the Estonian government, again, government in the EU, government in NATO, in good standing with Brussels. Their former prime minister is now the foreign minister of the EU. This little Estonia arrests nuns, arrests and expels nuns from the country. And what are the nuns doing? Even the security report was unable to present any evidence against them, other than, hey, they were collecting for food and medicine for fallen Russian soldiers. Even they try to hint, oh, they were, delivering weapons. It's a lie. It's a lie, because if they had any evidence that they were engaged in delivering weapons to the Russian army, they would have rushed front and center and claimed that they were delivering weapons. They were obviously not delivering weapons, but yeah, that's what nuns are supposed to do. They are supposed to tend to the sick and wounded. Yeah, food and medicine. Yeah. So yeah, it is depressing. That's the values laden Europe. And then Summer Petros says, last week I visited Whitehall, City of Westminster, London, and took this picture. Okay. Oh yeah, yeah, there it is. Yeah. Um, in the foreground is the cenotaph. Yeah, commemorating the British war dead. The building behind, sporting the Ukrainian flag, is the British Foreign and Commonwealth Ministry. And beyond is Downing Street and its black rail gates, the official residence of numerous recent British Prime Minister. Yeah, I saw that when I was last in London. It was stunning. I found it stunning the way the Ukrainian flag was flying on so many government buildings. It really is quite striking that hey, what the hell's the Ukrainian flag doing here? But yeah, it was the Foreign Office, but it's also the Ministry of Defense. It was flying over that as well, and and you're right about 10 Downing Street. I hadn't visited 10 Downing Street really for many years, obviously, and I thought, hey, I didn't know that it was all gated off, and there was all these essentially, as the way you put it, these black rail gates preventing anyone from entering Downing Street. But apparently that's been there since 1989. So just so shows how long ago that I last saw Downing Street. Very depressing that you can't even come close to the prime minister's residence. I mean, most of the country you can actually come. You can see the Kremlin. You can actually go to the White House. You can visit the White House. You can enter the Capitol building. I think you can visit the Elysee Palace, but you have to. You have this horrible gate preventing you from entering Downing Street, and the usual aggressive police officers minding the gate. So yeah, very very unpleasant. Anyway, thank you for reminding us, Summer Petros, and the time has come for the end of my live stream. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much for your comments. Thank you for your questions. Always really interesting and stimulating questions. I always enjoy them. And thank you above all to those who contributed to the tip jar. Because the dogs will be waking soon. First thing they do, they look into the tip jar and say, this is not acceptable. That's their go-to response. But I have to deal with them. I always have to deal after the live stream, try to reassure them things will get better. But anyway, thank you so much for your contributions. We'll be back on Thursday, 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Until then, good night. See you Thursday. Bye bye.